This is part 3 of WCF video series. In this video, we'll discuss creating a WCF service, hosting the WCF service using a console application, exposing two service endpoints, and finally, creating a Windows and a web client applications. This is continuation to part 2, so please watch part 2 from the WCF video series before proceeding with this video. We've got two clients. The first client is using a Java web application to communicate with our service. For him, interoperability is the main requirement, so he wants XML messages over HTTP protocol. To satisfy this client requirement, we have written the service using ASP.NET Web Services technology. The second client is using Windows application to communicate with our service. Windows application is also a .NET application. For him, performance is the main requirement. So he wants binary messages over TCP protocol. To satisfy this client requirement, we have rewritten the same service using a different technology, that is .NET Remoting. And in part 2, we have seen how different these two technologies are. Just because these different clients want different protocols and different message formats, we had to implement that service using two different technologies. With WCF, we don't have to use either .NET Remoting or ASP.NET Web Services anymore. We implement a single WCF service, and then we expose two endpoints. The first endpoint is going to exchange XML messages over HTTP protocol, so the interoperability requirement of the first client is met. The second endpoint is going to exchange binary messages over TCP protocol, so the requirement of the second client is also met. So here we are just using a single service. All we are doing is configuring two endpoints to satisfy both the client requirements. In case if we had a third client and if he wants a different set of protocols and message formats, we're going to expose another endpoint for him. But the service doesn't change in any way. It's just in the configuration file, we're going to introduce another endpoint. Now let's go ahead and implement a WCF service. Let's flip to Visual Studio. First, let's create a class library project. So File, New, Project. Let's add a class library project, and let's call this Hello Service. Let's delete this class1.cs file that is auto-generated for us. And to this project, let's add a WCF service. Add a new item and search for WCF. So here we have the WCF service, and let's name our WCF service as Hello Service. Look at this, adding a WCF service did two things here. The first thing is it has added a reference to system.service-model-assembly. System.service-model-assembly is the core to WCF. All the attributes and classes that we use with WCF are present in this assembly. And the second thing is it has added two class files, iHelloService.cs and HelloService.cs. If you look at this iHelloService.cs file, it has got an interface, iHelloService, and that's decorated with service contract attribute. Just by decorating this interface with the service contract attribute, we are turning this interface into a WCF service. And then notice that this interface has got one method, doWork, and that is decorated with the operation contract attribute. So by decorating a method with operation contract attribute, you're making that method available as part of this service to the client. So if you have, let's say, 10 methods, and if you want all those 10 methods to be available for your client, then you decorate all those 10 methods with operation contract attribute. Alright, now we want our method to be named as getMessage, and the return type should be string. And this message is going to have a parameter of type string, and let's call the parameter as name. Alright, now if you look at this helloservice.cs file, we have a class here, helloservice, and this class is actually implementing that iHelloService interface. Okay, now we have changed the name of the method, so let's delete this one. And when I click on this interface, look at this, I get an option to implement the interface iHelloService. So let's click on that. So it will automatically generate the method signature for us. Look at that, the name of the method is getMessage, return type is string, and it has got a parameter of type string. So all this method is going to do is return hello plus whatever string that we get into this method. Okay, so basically we have an interface here. The interface is decorated with service contract attribute. So this is a service contract, and within the service contract we have got one operation contract, meaning one operation that the client can invoke. And then within this file, hello service.cs file, we have provided the implementation for the interface method, for the service contract method, which is getMessage. Alright, so that's it. We are done building a WCF service. Now the next step is to actually host this WCF service. For hosting this WCF service, we are going to make use of a console application to keep things simple. But then a WCF service has got a lot of hosting options, meaning we can host a WCF service using a Windows Forms application, a Windows Service, or IIS. We'll discuss all these hosting options in a later video session. So let's go ahead and add a console application to this solution, and let's call it hello service host. Click OK. Now to host a service, we need to add a reference to the service model assembly. So let's add a reference to system.service_model. It's a .NET assembly, so make sure you have .NET tab selected, and system.service_model. Let's click OK. And then we need a reference to the service itself. So let's add a reference to that hello service project. So click on the projects tab and then select hello service. And then the most important thing is we need to specify the configuration. So we have the service ready. So we created this WCF service. Now within the configuration file, we're going to specify 2 endpoints for this WCF service. And we are going to do that within the host. When we host the service, that's when we specify the endpoints. So to this host project, let's add a configuration file, and to do that, right click on the project, add a new item, and we want to add application configuration file. So app.config, click add. So to this console application, it should add app.config file. So here we need to write some configuration basically to expose these 2 endpoints. So let's specify the configuration. So we use a system.service_model element, and within that we're going to have services. So let's specify a service. The first thing here, we need to specify the name of the service. What's the name of our service? The name is hello service, and then it is present in the namespace hello service. So the fully qualified name of our service is hello service.hello service. So this is the name of the class, and that's the name of the namespace. And then this service, that is our WCF service, is going to have 2 endpoints. So let's go ahead and specify those endpoints here. So endpoint. Now an endpoint needs to have 3 things. That is the address, binding, and the contract. Okay, so let's add them. First, address. So this address specifies to the client where your service is available. Okay, now we are going to make use of relative addresses. In a bit we'll talk more about this address if it's not clear at the moment. So for now, let's call it hello service. And then the next thing is we need to specify the binding, and this is the most important thing. In WCF there are several bindings, and if you want to have a look at all the bindings that are available with WCF, open this bindings element. So under service model, so we have this bindings element, and within bindings, when I open that angular bracket, look at this, these are several bindings which supports different protocols and message formats. We'll discuss these bindings in detail in a later video session. Now here with the first endpoint, we want to use HTTP protocol, and the messages should be in XML format. And the binding that support this message format and this HTTP protocol is basic HTTP binding. So here look at that, we have got basic HTTP binding. So let's copy that and specify as the binding name. And then the next thing is we need to specify the contract itself, that is the service contract. Okay, and that's how the client will come to know what are all the operations that are available within the contract. And what is our contract? Is nothing but the interface. So the name of the interface is hello service, and that's present in this namespace, hello service. So let's specify that as the contract, hello service dot hello service. That's the contract. Okay, so that's the first endpoint. Now this endpoint is going to satisfy the requirement of this client, but we need another endpoint to satisfy the requirement of this client. This client wants binary messages over TCP protocol. So we have another binding called net TCP binding. So this binding uses TCP protocol, and the message format will be binary by default. So let's use that binding. So let's make a copy of this endpoint. And here again the address is going to be hello service, and the binding is going to be net TCP binding, and contract again remains the same, hello service dot hello service. Alright, now we need to expose another endpoint here. That endpoint is basically for exchanging metadata. Now to consume a web service, what do clients do? They will invoke the URL with an add reference dialog box. They specify the URL of the WSDL document. Even with WCF, we use WSDL, that is Web Service Description Language files, to exchange metadata regarding the WCF service. Now we need to allow the service to exchange metadata, and we need to specify an endpoint for that as well. Okay, so let's specify the endpoint for metadata exchange. So endpoint, the address for this one is going to be max. Again, all these addresses are relative. We'll talk about them in just a bit. And the binding for metadata exchange is going to be a different binding, and that is called max HTTP binding. So let's specify that as the binding name. And then the contract is going to be metadata exchange. That's the name of the contract, to exchange metadata. So this is the endpoint that the users will hit to get the WSDL document. In a bit we'll see how the clients are going to use this endpoint to get the WSDL document, using which the client will generate the proxy classes. Alright, let's get rid of these bindings now. Alright, so we have specified the endpoints here. Another thing that we need to specify here is the base address. Now we have specified this address is a relative address. So let's specify a base address here. And to specify the base address, we are going to use the host element, and within that we are going to use base addresses element, and within that we are going to add two base addresses. So the first base address is going to be http://localhost:8080. You can give any available port on your machine. So basically this is one base address. Now to invoke the hello service using HTTP protocol, they're going to issue http://localhost:8080/hello service. That's the complete address to invoke the hello service using HTTP protocol. So our service will be available at port number 8080. And now for this endpoint, we're going to have another base address. Now this one is for use with TCP protocol. So the protocol here is going to be net.tcp://localhost, and let's use a different port number, 8090. So if somebody wants to use the TCP protocol and our hello service, what they do is net.tcp://localhost:8090/hello service. Alright, so that's the base addresses. Now we need to do one more thing, that is we need to specify service behaviors. And to specify service behaviors, we use behaviors element, and we want to specify service behaviors, and let's add a behavior. Now for a behavior can have a name, so let's call it max behavior. Basically this behavior is to allow the service to exchange metadata. Okay, in a bit you'll understand how we are going to make use of this one. Behavior, you can give it any meaningful name that you want, and within this behavior here we're going to specify service metadata, and we want to allow HTTP GET. If somebody requests the metadata of this service using HTTP GET, we want to allow that. So HTTP GET enabled equals true, so they're going to use the GET request to request the service metadata. Okay, and then the final thing that we need to do is associate this service behavior with our service itself. Okay, and to do that, look at the name of the behavior. It is max behavior, so let's copy that name, and then to link up this behavior with this service we are going to use behavior configuration and then specify the name there. That's it, we are done. Now let's set our service host as the startup project. So set a startup project, and then let's run this now. And before we do that, we actually need to open the service host. So let's get to the program.cs file. So this is a console application, and we have the main method here. So within the main method we need to open the service host for communication. So let's use system.service_model namespace, and within the system.service_model namespace we've got service host class. So service host, let's call it host, equals new service host. Now we're going to make use of this constructor where we need to specify the service type. Okay, so how do we get the type of a class or an interface? By using the type of keyword. So type of, and what is our service type? It's nothing but hello service within hello service. Okay, so let's copy hello service, type of hello service dot hello service, and then we are going to use host.open. So this should open the service for communication. Alright, now just to make sure that the service has started, let's print a message to the console. So console.writeLine, let's just say host started at whatever time the host has started. Let's use datetime.now.toString. And then finally, this is a console application, so when we run it, it's going to print this line and it will automatically close. So in order to prevent that from closing automatically, let's use console.readLine. Alright, we're done. So let's go ahead and run this. We have set this as our startup project, so let's run it by pressing Ctrl F5. So if we have done everything correctly, we should get no exceptions. Look at that, host started at that time and that date. Alright, now all that is left is to build the client applications. So let's start another instance of Visual Studio. And then first let's satisfy the requirement of the first client. So let's build an ASP.NET Web application. So file, new project, and let's use web under install templates, and let's create an empty ASP.NET Web application. Let's call this hello web client. But actually before we do that, let's create this project. But before we consume the service, if you recollect, within the service we have specified 3 endpoints. Okay, and this endpoint is for metadata exchange. Okay, so basically if I want the WSDL document of this service, if I visit this base URL and then specify this /max, we should be able to get the WSDL document associated with the service. So let's fire up a browser. Let's copy this URL and then specify it there. So now look at that, the service is running, and when we visited that URL localhost colon 8080, look at that, we have a WSDL document. Now when we click on that, look at that, it's very similar to the WSDL document that we have used with web services. Basically, this WSDL document is used by the client to generate the proxy classes using which we can communicate with the service. Okay, alright, now let's go back to our web application, and then we need to add a reference to the service itself. So right click on the references folder, add service reference option, and then specify the address. So that's the address which is going to give us the WSDL document. Click go. So this should connect to that service. Look at that, we have the hello service, and then within that service we have this get message operation. Alright, let's give it a meaningful namespace. Let's call it hello service and click OK. So this should add a reference to that service. Look at that, it has automatically generated the proxy classes for us here, hello service, and then within the web.config file it has generated a lot of configuration for us. If you remember, we have specified two endpoints. Look at that, this one is using HTTP protocol, that's the URL to invoke the service, and this one is using TCP protocol, and that's the port number. Okay, and then here we've got two bindings. The first one is the basic binding, basic HTTP binding, and that's the name of that binding. And here we've got net TCP binding, and that's the name of the TCP binding. Okay, alright, now let's get to look at this. It has also added a reference to system.service model assembly. Now let's right click on this project and add a web form. And on this web form we need a text box control. First of all, let's set the style attribute, and let's set font family to Arial, and let's drag and drop a text box control, a button control, and a label control. So let's include an HTML break here. Alright, on the button let's say the text is get message, and then let's get rid of this default text and let's set font bold equals true. Alright, let's flip this to the design mode. Let's double click on the button control to generate the click event handler, and here we need to create an instance of the proxy class. And if you remember, the namespace that we have given is hello service. Within that we should have hello service client, so that is client equals new client, and then client dot get message, and then obviously we need to pass the name. Where are we going to get the name from text box 1 control, and then whatever response that we get back, we are going to display that within label 1 control. So label 1.text equals that. Now when we run this, this is actually going to throw an exception. We'll fix that in just a bit. Okay, so let's enter Prajim and click get message. And look at that, it throws an exception. It says an endpoint configuration section for contract hello service could not be loaded because more than one endpoint configuration for that contract was found. So within the web.config file of our client application, there are more than one endpoint. Okay, so we need to basically specify which endpoints we want to use. Do you want to use this endpoint or do you want to use this endpoint? So let's use this endpoint. So basic HTTP binding. So and then when we build the client using the client constructor, we can specify the endpoint configuration name. Alright, with this, let's go ahead and run it. So now this is going to use basic HTTP binding. So let's say Prajim get message. Look at that, hello Prajim, it works as expected. Alright, now let's quickly go ahead and build a Windows application and use TCP binding there, and it turns out to be, the steps are very similar. So let's create a file, new project, and this time let's create a Windows Forms application, and let's call this hello Windows client. Click OK, and then we need to add a reference to the service itself. And what is the URL of the service where we can get metadata? Localhost colon 8080, and then click go. So this should find that service. We have that get message, and let's give it a meaningful namespace. Let's call it hello service. Look at this, these steps are very similar to what we have done. Alright, again it has generated the proxy class. So let's go ahead, drag and drop a text box button and a label control. So we need a text box, we need a button, and finally we need a label. Alright, let's arrange these things a bit. Let's quickly change the font size of the label control. So let's set font size to something 15 so that we can see it properly. Alright, let's click the button to generate the click event handler. So what we need to do here, create the proxy class hello service dot hello service client. Let's call it client equals new hello service client, and we need to specify which endpoint we want to use. So within within app.config file, this is a Windows Forms application, so there is app.config file. So within that there are again two bindings. So which binding do you want to use? So the Windows application wants to use TCP protocol and binary messages, so we are going to use this binding, net TCP binding. So let's copy that and specify that as the binding name, and then client dot get message. So where is the message going to come from? From the text box control. So text box 1.text, and this get message is going to return a string which we want to display in label 1 control. That's it. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it works as expected. Alright, so let's pass Prajim as the text. And look at that, hello Prajim. So now, just by exposing two endpoints, our both client requirements are met. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.